60 differences between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic. 8 of them are covered in Part 1. If you missed that, click the link in the description. Note that we're talking about Catholics in the Roman Rite, not Eastern Catholics, though I may mention them sometimes. Now, let's keep going. In this video, the differences are primarily in the sacraments. Note that just because something is different does not always mean that one side views the other's position as wrong or even problematic. In fact, this first difference is generally considered quite minor. Difference number 9 is numbering the sacraments. For the Catholics, the Council of Trent decreed, "If anyone saith that the sacraments of the new law were not all instituted by Jesus Christ our Lord, or that they are more or less than 7, to wit, baptism, confirmation, the Eucharist, penance, extreme unction, order, and matrimony, or even that any one of these 7 is not truly and properly a sacrament, let him be anathema." If Orthodox do provide a number of sacraments, they do say 7, but often they prefer to leave them uncounted. The Orthodox Church in America has published a series of articles on their website written by Protopresbyter Thomas Hopko titled The Orthodox Faith, and one says, "The practice of counting the sacraments was adopted in the Orthodox Church from the Roman Catholics. It is not an ancient practice of the Church, and in many ways it tends to be misleading, since it appears that there are just 7 specific rites which are sacraments, and that all other aspects of the life of the Church are essentially different from these particular actions. The more ancient and traditional practice of the Orthodox Church is to consider everything which is in and of the Church as sacramental or mystical." Another difference relates to the sacrament of Holy Communion, or Eucharist. For Roman Catholics, the bread in this sacrament is unleavened, and for the Orthodox it is leavened. Notably, this is one of those areas where Eastern Catholics follow the Orthodox in practice, which shows that the Catholic Church doesn't view the practice as entirely unacceptable. But for the vast majority of Catholics the world over, what they receive in Mass looks quite different from what the Orthodox receive. Not only is the bread unleavened in a Catholic Mass, but for most it is in the form of a small round wafer, while Orthodox have much larger loaves called prosphora, which are broken up by the priest. The ingredients in the bread also differ, with there being salt in the Orthodox version, for example. Another difference with the Eucharist is the way that Christ is viewed as being present in it. Both Catholics and Orthodox affirm that the elements become the body and blood of Christ. However, Catholics get more specific than Orthodox do generally. The Catholic position is transubstantiation, in which the bread and wine change into the body and blood of Christ, the bread and wine cease to exist, yet the characteristics of the bread and wine remain. This is viewed as a miraculous transformation, where one thing is turned into another in its essential reality, but the accidents or the inessential characteristics of that original thing, such as its shape, taste, color, consistency, and such, remain. Orthodox churches like to simply say that the bread and wine are Christ's body and blood, without explaining this in any philosophical way. The Orthodox Church in America website says, "The mystery of the Holy Eucharist defies analysis and explanation in purely rational and logical terms." Many Orthodox wouldn't necessarily say that the Catholic position is definitely wrong, it's just that they won't go that deep into explaining things, especially not dogmatically so. It's worth noting that some in Orthodoxy have used the term of transubstantiation in the past. Eucharistic Adoration is another difference in Orthodox and Catholic practice. In Catholic parishes, a consecrated host may be placed in a monstrance to be adored, and there are even processions and societies that have the purpose of adoring Christ in the form of the Eucharist. This is simply not something that happens in Eastern Orthodox churches. Though some of what takes place in the Divine Liturgy itself may be classified as adoration, outside of that context there is no adoration. This, in and of itself, is not a statement that such is certainly unacceptable, however. Father Patrick Cardine of St. Patrick Orthodox Church in Beetleton, Virginia, a Western Rite parish of the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese, says that many Eastern Orthodox disparage the practice, but he himself advocates it as perhaps the Western devotion that most perfectly embodies and expresses the essence of our Orthodox life. Another difference relates to Eucharistic miracles. Though the Orthodox Church does not deny that these happen, and there are some reports, they are far less emphasized and frequent in the Orthodox Church than what you find in Catholicism. Eucharistic miracles are frequently used by Catholics as an apologetic tool to support the authenticity of real presence, but in Orthodoxy, if anything, they're minimized. Many might view this as an insignificant difference, but to many in Catholicism who have devoted their whole lives to defense of or devotion to specific Eucharistic miracles, it can be a radical thing to see a tradition where this theology is so seemingly absent. A bigger and more substantial difference, though, is the issue of communion under one kind. This is the practice in many Catholic parishes, to have communicants receive only one of the two elements, most commonly the bread only, while the priest alone takes the wine. It must be emphasized that Catholics have no problem with communion under both kinds. If anything, the Catechism supports this view as a more complete practice. However, for Orthodox churches, everyone receives both the bread and the wine. Another Eucharist difference is that of when a person is allowed to receive. For the Catholic Church, First Communion is normally around age 7. However, for Orthodox churches, infants are not only allowed to commune, but the practice is viewed as necessary. Eastern Catholics, like the Orthodox, will commune infants, but for most Catholics the world over, the practice is forbidden. Churching is another difference in today's practice of Orthodox and Catholic churches. Antiochian Orthodox Parish St. Andrew Orthodox Church in Riverside, California explains the practice. After giving birth, a mother does not come to the church temple for 40 days, with one reason being an imitation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Most Orthodox churches still have this practice, and though it was also practiced by Catholics in the past, it is today present mostly in only the Eastern Catholic tradition. The sacrament of confirmation is another difference between Catholics and Orthodox. For the Orthodox, Chrismation, which is the equivalent sacrament to confirmation, takes place immediately after infant baptism. However, Roman Catholics observe the sacrament either around age 13 or, in some cases, together with First Communion around age 7. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Nelson says, "A candidate for confirmation who has attained the age of reason must profess the faith, be in the state of grace, have the intention of receiving the sacrament, and be prepared to assume the role of disciple and witness to Christ, both within the ecclesial community and in temporal affairs." Confirmation is that sacrament that seals with the Holy Spirit, so the difference in the age this is done is not an insignificant matter. Eastern Catholics also commonly perform the sacrament at infant baptism with permission from the Holy See, but for most Catholics, this is not allowed. For Catholics, the sacrament of confirmation can licitly be performed by a priest only, but the standard practice is that it be done by a bishop. This is not the case in most Orthodox parishes where priests administer the chrismation. In most Catholic churches, the head is anointed with the holy oil, also known as chrism, while in Orthodoxy and Eastern Catholic churches, the chrism is often anointed on various parts of the infant's body. Tonsure refers to cutting the hair as part of religious devotion. There are at least 3 types of tonsure: monastic, clerical, and baptismal. Monastic tonsure is still practiced in Orthodoxy and by a very small subset of Catholics. Historically, Catholic monks would have a large tonsure that was maintained. For Orthodox, the tonsure is a one-time thing, and following it, generally, the monk no longer shaves or cuts their hair at all. Secondly is clerical tonsure, which would take place immediately prior to ordination, and after 1972 is no longer a regular practice of the Catholic Church, though still practiced by a minority, such as priests of the FSSP, as a one-time thing and not maintained. For Orthodoxy, tonsure is still widely practiced before ordination as a reader. Today, many Catholic clerics do still have something that harkens back to the clerical tonsure, wearing a zacchetto, which had a purpose of insulating the area of the tonsure. Popes wear them in white, bishops in purple, and cardinals in red. The baptismal tonsure is the cutting of hair at baptism, whether of an infant or of a convert. This is the regular practice in Orthodoxy, and with the exception of Eastern Catholics, not the practice of the Catholic Church. Baptism in an Orthodox church may look different from a Catholic church in other ways as well. For Orthodox churches, baptism is by immersion, whether for infants or converts. Immersion is practiced by Roman Catholics as well, but pouring is much more common and is the standard mode used in most parishes. You won't find baptism by pouring in Orthodox churches unless possibly by exception. It's also worth mentioning here that there are some differences in the timing of baptism between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. Catholic canon law says that a child ought to be baptized in the first few weeks. Many Greek Orthodox parishes say that baptism of a child is generally between 3 and 10 months. Many Orthodox practice baptism at a 40-day churching. Another baptism difference is the question of so-called rebaptism. Both Catholics and Orthodox oppose the practice of rebaptism, or anabaptism, as it has also been called. A person who has been validly baptized should not be baptized again. However, there are cases where a person has been involved in something called baptism, which both churches don't recognize as actually baptism. Therefore, they would have such a person who had the pseudo-baptism in the past submit to proper baptism. For Catholics, most most baptisms will be accepted as valid. You can be baptized by pouring, sprinkling, or immersion. The formula used can vary so long as I baptize is used along with the three persons of the Trinity and the right intention. You could be baptized by a church that is Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, or of course an Orthodox church. The standards of who needs to be baptized and who has valid baptism are the same around the world and in Eastern Catholic churches. For Orthodoxy, though, this is not the case. All Saints Greek Orthodox Church in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania says, in general, the Orthodox Church does not rebaptize a Christian who has received baptism in a mainline Protestant or the Roman Catholic Church. However, many parishes of the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia will require a person baptized as a Protestant or a Catholic to submit to baptism to join the church, and this is also the case in some stricter churches in other Orthodox jurisdictions. It's not a high percentage of Orthodox churches in the United States that require this, however. There are also differences in confession and absolution between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. First, in the Catholic Church, when confessing, one is responsible to tell the priest how many times he or she has committed each sin. In Orthodox confession, the numbering of sins is not necessary. In Catholic confessions, the wording used by priests in the Latin Church includes, I absolve you from your sins. St. Mary Antiochian Orthodox Church in Omaha, Nebraska says on their website, but an Orthodox priest does not say, I absolve you during a confession, as does a Catholic priest. Instead, at that point in the Orthodox rite, the priest says, my spiritual child, who has confessed unto me, I, a humble sinner, have not power to forgive sins, but God alone. Is there a substantial difference here? Another Orthodox priest says, in the absolution, the Orthodox priest simply declares to penitent sinners that God forgives them, for the church is not a law court, and the priest does not have the power to declare them legally innocent or guilty. Some in Orthodoxy consider the Catholic priest's declaration to be a significant error, and others do not. Catholics tend to view the difference as less substantial. The Catholic Church views the Orthodox confession as valid, indicating a belief that there is not something essential lacking in the sacrament. Another difference in Catholicism and Orthodoxy on the subject of confession is whether there are some sins that a priest is not permitted to fully handle. The Baltimore Catechism, a Catholic catechism, says on this, the priest has the power to forgive all sins in the sacrament of penance, but he may not have the authority to forgive all. The sins which the priest has no authority to absolve are called reserved sins. Absolution from these sins can be obtained only from the bishop, and sometimes only from the pope, or by his special permission. In Orthodoxy, there is no list of reserved sins that priests are not authorized to handle in confession. The Orthodox and Catholic churches have a lot that they agree on as it relates to the Virgin Mary. Both teach that she was a virgin not only when she gave birth to Christ, but also perpetually. Both refer to her as Mother of God, though in Orthodoxy it's more common to hear this in transliterated Greek, Theotokos. However, there are also some differences. One of those is the doctrine surrounding the end of her life. The Orthodox position, called the Dormition of the Theotokos, is defined on the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America's blog website. Mary died a physical death, but that when the apostles opened her tomb on the third day it was empty, and that this means her body ascended into heaven. The Catholic position, called the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, may look similar. It says that Mary was assumed body and soul into heaven at the end of her earthly life. This does, however, leave an ambiguity, as pointed out by Deacon Matthew Newsom. Note that the Pope is silent on whether or not she actually died. Most theologians are in agreement that she did, in fact, die a normal death, but the Church has not defined the issue one way or another. However, some Catholic parishes do present the doctrine as saying that Mary did not die. In general, then, the difference is that the Catholic position leaves whether Mary died or not an open question, while the Orthodox position says she did die. Looking back to the opposite end of Mary's life, we find the doctrine of Mary's Immaculate Conception. According to Catholic theology, this means that Mary was born without original sin or its stain. However, Orthodox churches reject this teaching. First, as mentioned in difference number 3, the Orthodox Church doesn't believe in original sin in the way that the Catholics do, and also, Orthodox view this doctrine in light of the Dormition of the Theotokos as well. The Greek Orthodox Archdiocese's website says, basically, the dogma of the Immaculate Conception is built on the Latin Church's theology of the original sin. If Mary was preserved free from the original sin, thus exempt from it, then she would not be subject to the consequence of it, which is death. This would explain the notion that in body and soul she was assumed into heaven. The Orthodox Church does not support such belief, rather that she died a physical death just like all mankind, but because her body was sacred, she ascended into heaven. However, all things in context, Orthodox don't believe that Mary had original sin because they don't believe anyone does. Both Catholics and Orthodox affirm that Mary was not guilty of any personal sin, that she lived a perfect life. However, Catholic theologians often also say that Mary was impeccable, incapable of sinning. This is not the case in Orthodoxy. Greek Orthodox priest Timothy Pavlatos writes, "Just as the Mother of God was full of grace by participation and not by nature, she was likewise sinless by participation of her free will and not by nature. Only Jesus Christ was born perfectly holy and sinless, sinless by nature and by choice." Another difference relating to Mary is that of Marian Apparitions. Appearances of the Virgin Mary are not dogmatic teachings of the Catholic Church, meaning anyone can choose to believe or to doubt them, but hundreds of books have been written on them, parishes have been named for them, feasts have been proclaimed, and millions of Catholics have gone on pilgrimages to the sites where they occurred. Some converts from Orthodoxy to Catholicism have mentioned apparitions as being part of the reason they converted. Although there have also been Marian apparitions in Orthodoxy, there is much less popular knowledge of or devotion relating to these events. Most Orthodox doubt many or all of the Catholic apparitions. Some may view this difference as not being substantial, but for some Catholics whose devotional life may be saturated with Marian apparitions, it is significant to consider that the Orthodox Church does not provide much in the way of support and often lends skepticism toward their legitimacy. Also in the Catholic Church is a tradition called Stigmata, which is a phenomenon where people find they have wounds or scars in the places that Jesus was wounded during his passion. St. Francis of Assisi is the first known stigmatic, and after having a vision found that he had the wounds of Christ mirrored on his body. Other examples are St. Catherine of Siena and Francesco Forgione, better known as Padre Pio. There are also some Catholics who say that Paul the Apostle himself was a stigmatic, claiming the passage in Galatians 6:17, "I bear on my body the marks of Jesus," as evidence for this. In Orthodoxy, this is an unknown phenomenon. The Orthodox Church in America website says that it is foreign to the Orthodox experience and the Church takes no position on them. We're now 27 differences in, but there are many more to come as we explore the teachings and practice of the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. If you've learned something from the first two videos, consider subscribing to Ready to Harvest and sharing this video with someone you know. If you haven't seen the Ready to Harvest channel before, it's all about explaining denominations of Christianity from a neutral perspective. If you want to learn more about a denomination, there's probably already a video on this channel about them.